Hello, this is Professor Nassar, and I'm here today to talk to you about the histology of the gastrointestinal tract. We will be looking at 4 representative slides of the gastrointestinal tract, of the GI tract. But before we get to the slides, what I want to do is just give a brief overview in terms of some of the structures that we will be seeing. One of the most important things on the slides is if we give you a sample slide of somewhere on the GI tract, you have to be able to distinguish it from the other parts of the GI, and the slides that we'll be showing you sort of help to give an overview of that, so you can sort of go through, have a mental checklist, and sort of very quickly, when you're looking at a slide or a photo of a slide, you can sort of have a mental checklist in your head. Is it showing A, B, C, or D? And if so, what features are there or not there? That allows you to limit what is what, and rule out some options and focus in on what you might be seeing and what we might be throwing at you. Okay, I'm going to go through this quickly, again, because I apologize for the quickness in which I will be going through this. But again, you can review this on your own time, and in theory, what you should have also open with you is both your lab manual as well as a copy of your textbook, or either in print form or version form, to sort of go through this together. What this tries to do is sort of put all of these 4 structures sort of compared side by side, so you can just sort of see it all in one field of view. So let's go through. The 4 slides we're going to be looking at are the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, which will be represented by the duodenum, and the large intestine, which will be represented by the colon. The epithelium, the type of epithelium that we see in each of these features is a little different. Recall that there are 4 layers of tissue that make up each of these features, and we're going to be looking at these layers in these slides. There's going to be a mucosal layer, a submucosal layer, a layer called the muscularis externa, and finally a layer which is either called the adventitia or the serosa, depending on where you are. I'm not going to go into the details of this here, we simply don't have time, but also these are available for you on your slide and have in theory been provided to you by your instructor or by me in another video. So recall that the mucosal layer is divided into 3 subdivisions, and the first of those is the epithelium. The epithelium of the esophagus is a little different, where the epithelium of the GI tract changes a little bit depending on where you are in the GI. And this is one way to sort of hone in on which part of the GI tract you're looking at. The epithelium of the esophagus is stratified squamous epithelium. It's rather thick. Keep in mind, when you're eating all those Doritos have sharp edges, and those sharp edges can sort of scrape along the lining of your esophagus. And so you have a thick protective layer of epithelium there to sort of protect your tissue layer from harm or damage from the food that you're eating. The remainder of the GI tract, when the esophagus meets the stomach, the nature of the epithelium changes from stratified squamous epithelium to simple columnar, and it stays as simple columnar in the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine, all the way until you get to the anus, where it changes back to stratified squamous epithelium, because the anus is really skin. With regard to the specific types of epithelial cells that we will be asking you to look at, in the stomach we're going to ask you to find mucus cells, parietal cells, which recall secrete hydrochloric acid, and chief cells, which secrete an enzyme called pepsinogen. In the small intestine, we will be asking you to look for 2 types of cells. The main type is are called either absorptive cells or enterocytes. And also we will be asking you to look for goblet cells, the same kind of cells that we saw way back in the trachea. In the large intestine, we'll be asking you to look for enterocytes, but also there will be many goblet cells there. This column here is to just sort of give you a comparison for the different cell types that we see. In the esophagus, the epithelium is the stratified squamous epithelium. There's no distinctive cell types that we're going to be asking you to look for there. The other feature you're going to need to keep track of, and to help you identify or hone in on which part of the GI tract you're looking at, is sometimes you will see glandular tissue in different layers of the tissues. Some of these features, some of these organs have glandular tissue in the mucosa, some have them in the submucosa. The ones that have glands in the submucosa are the esophagus and the duodenum. The stomach does have glands in it, but the glands are in the mucosal layer. Okay, and then this final part down here is to just give you an idea of sort of a cartoonish version of how the epithelial layer is going to be a little different as you move from one part of the GI tract to the other. Here I have an image of the stomach, the small intestine, and then the large intestine represented by the colon. In the stomach, it's going to look something like this. It's not going to be as distinct when you look at this because all the tissue tends to get a bit smushed together. But ideally, it looks something like this. Say you were a little, you could shrink yourself down basically and sort of walk along the surface of the stomach. You would be walking along a layer of simple columnar epithelial cells. And then what you would have to be careful of is that it would look relatively like a flat, smooth surface. But what you have to be careful of is on occasion, you're going to run into this deep crevice that we call a gastric pit. This pit is rather deep and it contains gastric glands. It's deep, sort of like, you remember in the first Indiana Jones movie when Harrison Ford and Alfred Molina are trying to escape from that temple in the opening of the film, and then at some point they have to jump across this deep chasm, and first his buddy goes, and then Harrison Ford says, "Throw me the whip," and the other guy says, "Throw me the idol." He says, so he throws him the idol, and Molina says, "Adios, amigo," and Harrison Ford jumps. Remember all that? This is that sort of situation that you would encounter here. So in this case, there is a gastric pit, and the cells that make up the pit and the lining of the pit and the glands and so forth, there are a number of cells in here, but we want you to look for 3 of them. The bulk of the cells that make up the pit and the regions of the pit, which are outlined more in the text, are called mucus cells. And what they secrete is mucus, really a secretion of water and this other substance called bicarbonate, which helps reduce the acidity of what's coming out, being secreted by the parietal cells from the stomach. There are 2 other cell types we want you to look for. In addition to the pit, deeper down, the base of the pit is a structure that we call a gastric gland. There can be, sometimes the pit will bifurcate, sometimes it will split up into 3, 4, and so on. In this case, I just have it splitting up into 2. The gastric glands also contain mucus cells, but in addition, they contain 2 other cell types. One type are called parietal cells, which secrete hydrochloric acid. The other kind are called sheath cells that secrete a substance called pepsinogen, which will turn into pepsin, which will help you digest, start with the beginning of the digestion of proteins. I've drawn these as sort of reddish and bluish because when you look at these histologically, the parietal cells are going to look pink and the sheath cells are going to look blue. In the small intestine, we lose the gastric pits and we also lose the mucus cells. The mucus cells go away. The gastric pits are sort of modified into something else. If you were basically walking from the stomach and then ended up in the small intestine, what you would see, instead of just these pits, the pits here are renamed as crypts. And in addition to the crypts, or the invaginations of the epithelium, we also have evaginations of the epithelium, which are called, the plural is villi, the singular is villus. They are essentially sort of finger-like projections that stick up. And both of these help to increase the surface area for absorbing nutrients, which happens here in the villi, and for secreting enzymes and other types of substances, which happen here at the crypts. So the villi, in part, are for absorption. The crypts can also potentially help absorb and also help secrete. Again, this is made up of simple columnar epithelium, and what we want you to appreciate when you look at a single villus is something like this. Here I've enlarged just the tip of a villus, and the villi, the cells that make up the epithelium of the villus, are really two kinds of cells we want you to appreciate. First of all, you will find that there are goblet cells, and the goblet cells will be secreting mucus, just like the goblet cells do in the trachea. The goblet cells here in the small intestine are really a replacement of the mucus cells here, which also secrete mucus. They're essentially secreting similar substances, watery-based fluid. In addition, the other predominant cell type that we see here are cells that are called absorptive cells. Your textbook or some other textbooks may call them enterocytes. They go by a couple of different names. And what's notable about them is that they contain microvilli on their surfaces. The microvilli contain enzymes that also help you absorb food. The microvilli also are sometimes known as a brush border, because it makes the microvilli make the apical ends of the cell look a little fuzzy in their appearance. Finally, when you get to the colon, the villi disappear. You have only crypts. So if you're walking along the colon, the villi that you had here in the small intestine vanish, and all that remains is crypt after crypt after crypt. And again, it's made up of simple columnar epithelial cells. The bulk or the majority of the cells that you will see here in the colon are goblet cells, as well as your absorptive cells, but they are not as frequently seen, though of course they are there. Again, the changes in the lining of the epithelium are all meant to be reflective of the different functions that the stomach, the small intestine, and the colon have. That is outlined more in the book. Here I'm just trying to give you a general brief overview in terms of what these features look like and what to keep in mind to help you distinguish one from the other. What I would do when studying is try to give yourself either a histological view of the esophagus or the stomach, the duodenum or the colon, just a blank slide, and try to identify what it is without sort of knowing in advance. Just sort of make some cards or pictures or mix them up randomly. And try to use some of these features to help you distinguish one from the other. What makes the colon distinct from the small intestine? What makes the small intestine distinct from the stomach? What makes the stomach distinct from the esophagus? This chart here and these figures here, I hope, help you with that. Okay, thank you very much, and we will stop there and I will move on to the slides next.